the what we're seeing across the country and the escalation?
What we're seeing across Israel, the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza is an escalation, the likes of which we haven't seen really since 2014, when there was a major war between Israel and Gaza. Since Friday, things have escalated and really moved from Jerusalem, where they were protests against forced house evictions, protests against police restrictions on access to the old city to Palestinians, and now Hamas has become involved, Islamic Jihad have become involved from Gaza, firing missiles. And in fact, many Palestinians here in Jerusalem are somewhat resentful of the fact that these factions have become involved from Gaza, because the attention has really shifted from the situation in Jerusalem, which is really a civil rights question, to really one of war, in which Israel and the Palestinian factions in Gaza are trading these strikes. Now, what you just heard is just fireworks here, because the end of Ramadan is coming to an end within the next day, so that's nothing to worry about. Victor,
okay,
Christy.
Thank you very much. And we want to bring in Aaron David Miller. He's our CNN Global Affairs analyst, former State Department Middle East negotiator. Aaron, David, I know that you're no stranger, obviously, to the tinderbox that is the Middle East. But as Ben was just saying, in Hadass, they haven't seen the scope of this. The fires in Tel Aviv, things like that, since 2014. How did this escalate so quickly to where we are? And just give us the context.
I mean, it's stunning that a conflict that had been focused and centered on Jerusalem and localized has now broadened. The very essence of this conflict has now changed. And Ben's words, I think, are quite wise. There's an enormous amount of resentment that Hamas, Palestine Islamic Jihad, is now involved in this, because it shifts the whole character and operation. You've heard that the Biden administration unmitigated support for Israel, right to defend itself, and Hamas now seeking to take advantage of defending Jerusalem, has now unleashed a barrage of rockets, which inevitably is going to draw an intense Israeli response. This does resemble 2014, which went on for almost 7 or 8 weeks. It ended with an Egyptian brokered, very messy ceasefire. And the casualties were horrendous, particularly on the Palestinian side, anywhere from 2,200 to 2,300 dead, 67 Israeli soldiers and 5 Israeli civilians. That was the asymmetrical nature of the casualty count, largely because of Israel's Iron Dome defensive capacity and its determination to strike disproportionately in Gaza. So again, how long this will go on is unclear. But the one takeaway from this is that it's hard to see how any of this is going to lead to any sort of outcome that will fundamentally leave Palestinians and Israelis in a better position than when they started. More death, more destruction, more mistrust, more bloodshed, and little pathway under these circumstances, Victor and Allison, for a more hopeful conclusion. And therein lies the real tragedy.
I want to come back to that point in just a moment, but let's go now to Ashkelon, where Hadass Gold is still there in that shelter. And we have to remember that there is no siren that sounds in Gaza. There is no Iron Dome. But where you have been there in Ashkelon, we've heard the sirens, you've heard the sirens almost continuously. How long have you been in that shelter, and how often is this happening? And what's the clear for people to go back to their homes?
I think it is a very important point to keep in mind that the people in Gaza do not have an Iron Dome and may not even have necessarily the same sort of shelters. But here in Ashkelon, we've been hearing these air raid sirens all day long. I have to be honest, I've lost count of the number of times that we have heard the sirens and have come running into this shelter. And we would hear them also while we were still in the shelter, because we would kind of stay in place for a few minutes afterwards, and then there would be another siren. I've had several times where I've been live on air already today, and we've heard the sirens, and we've had to come rushing in. The residents here are coming in and out, going back up to their apartments, coming back down. For now, they're mostly staying put in this shelter. They have brought food and water down here. They're being very kind to us, sharing their food and water with us, making us coffee, letting us use their facilities. But this is where they are staying in, because when those air raid sirens go off here in Ashkelon, as close as we are to Gaza, you have about 15 to 30 seconds to get yourself into a protected space. And we have also seen just the rockets ourselves with our own eyes. We've been outside. We'll see them flash up in the sky. We've also heard airplanes, jets flying overhead, and then occasionally we'll hear booms in the distance. It's hard for us from here to tell if those sounds are from airstrikes, if they're from rockets, if they're from the Iron Dome intercepting some of those rockets. Because it's so hard to tell, you can't take chances here. And so for many of the residents here, they go running into shelters. When we were in this shelter actually earlier, what happens is if you're out on the street, if you're driving your car, you're supposed to get out, you're supposed to get off the street and go immediately into the nearest building and into a shelter. And actually, while we were in the shelter earlier today, these two women came running in, and one of them even said to the other, "Did you turn off the car?" And she said, "No, I just went running out." And that's what's happening here. This is what life has been like here for the past 24 hours or so.
Hadass, it's so helpful for the rest of the world to have you there on the ground, and we all did watch your live shot earlier this morning when the sirens went off and you had to immediately race with your crew into the shelter there. It doesn't appear to be simmering down. It appears, as we look at the other side of your screen, the fires in Tel Aviv, to be escalating. How long can you and others stay in that shelter?
Well, people will stay in here until it's safe for them to go out. And occasionally, when there are lulls in between the air raid sirens, they will go out for some fresh air. They'll go back up to their apartments to get drinks. And like I said, they've been so kind to us, sharing their food and water with us. But you know, people here are prepared to spend the night here. We've seen people bringing down blankets. There's some chairs and couches down here, and they will be prepared to spend the night here because we just don't know what the night will bring. And the same with people in Gaza. We cannot forget the people in Gaza are also facing some incredibly scary and tense moments right now.
Aaron, how much consideration should be given to the variable of the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is in the political fight of his career after a fourth election, still struggling to form a coalition government, may face a fifth, in the question of what happens next?
It's a fascinating question, and I've heard both sides of the argument. Mr. Netanyahu needs a crisis. This could generate a great difficulty on the part of the opposition in forming a change coalition, quote unquote, largely because that change coalition is dependent on one small Arab party who would support the government from the outside. The more destruction and deaths of Palestinians there are during the course of this conflict, the more difficult it's going to be. In fact, Mansour Abbas, the head of that party, has suspended, at least temporarily, coalition negotiations. I mean, right now it looks to me like, it depends on the intensity of this and how long it goes on. But it seems clear Mr. Netanyahu has the support of Benny Gantz, who is part of that opposition. He's currently Minister of Defense. The Israelis are putting on a unified front right now. And I think it's impossible to say right now, Victor Allison, which way these coalition negotiations are going to go. Usually, and we've seen four of these Israeli Hamas confrontations: 2008, 09, 2012, 2014, and now this. Usually they end because the Israelis cannot and do not want to sustain a situation where Ben Gurion Airport, their major airport, remains closed because of the fear of rocket attacks, or their citizens in shelters. And Hamas cannot withstand for a prolonged period of time the kind of destruction that is going to make residents of Gaza, however proud they may be of Hamas's defense of quote unquote Jerusalem in this latest round. So I suspect this one will end. I don't think it's going to go on for 7 to 8 weeks. But right now, how it's going to end is very up there.
And Aaron David, as you point out, Ben Gurion The international airport is closed right now because of the threat of incoming rocket fire. It's 15 kilometers from Tel Aviv. Also, this is just coming in from the White House. President Biden is calling for an end to the violence. He has directed his team to engage intensively with Israeli and Palestinian leaders. His press secretary says we stand against extremism that has inflicted violence on both communities. And I mean, you have been that person who has engaged intensively. And what can the U.S. do?
Well, in this case, this is a multi-dimensional, multi-front confrontation. You've got Jerusalem Palestinians, you've got Israeli Arabs rioting in towns like Ramallah, Lod, and Nazareth within Israel proper, and you have Hamas. The United States doesn't have influence or direct contacts with Hamas. And they can do very little, it seems to me, and neither can Mahmoud Abbas. He doesn't have much control over the Palestinians in Jerusalem. I think we're going to have to rely heavily on the Egyptians. They came through in 2014 in the Operation Protective Edge, which was so costly in terms of Palestinian lives. We're going to have to rely heavily on the Egyptians. But we're also, I suspect, going to have to navigate a very fine line with our close Israeli ally. And this is an administration that has a domestic agenda that is going to require tremendous political support. It's going to be tough given Biden's priorities with the Israelis.
Let's show you the video again of that tower, 13-story tower. We've got video in now. It collapsed. We showed you the video just moments ago. The strike on this tower is what led to the retaliation in Tel Aviv that we showed you the flames of earlier. 150 airstrikes more than on targets in Gaza. The Palestinian Health Ministry says that the airstrikes have killed at least 28 people, including 10 children. We've got our Hadass Gold, who is in Ashkelon. And the responses, aside from the rockets, the airstrikes that we've seen, what have we heard from the IDF, from the Israeli government, about where this goes next?
Well, the Israeli military has seen this as what they call an unacceptable attack from Hamas, especially when Jerusalem was targeted yesterday at 6 p.m. Air raid sirens sounded in Jerusalem and 6 rockets were fired towards Jerusalem, something that has not happened in a very, very long time. And they said that Netanyahu has threatened Hamas and said that they will receive attacks they did not anticipate. Now, the Israeli military says that they have struck more than 300 targets in the Gaza Strip. They said about 150 of them were specifically sort of rocket launcher areas. They say they have killed 20 militants at least, including the head of the sort of anti-tank missile division, and they are continuing to strike. We've been hearing airplanes flying overhead. We've been hearing explosions in the distance, and it's just a very quickly developing situation. The Israeli military has also said they've called up thousands of reserves to be prepared to strengthen their positions. They have also said they've targeted tunnels, they say, Hamas tunnels that Hamas operatives were trying to use. And now they are, as we've seen, targeting these buildings that could mean that they believe that these buildings are either important headquarters for Hamas. It's hard to tell right now, as this is a very quickly developing situation. And just in the past few minutes here, we continue to hear all day long, all evening long, air raid sirens. That's why we're in the shelter right now, because otherwise when you're outside, you have seconds to run in. We've been hearing rockets. We've been hearing explosions. They could be interceptions from the Iron Dome. They could be rockets landing. They could be airstrikes in the distance. Because it's so hard to know, you have to play it safe here.
All right, Hadass Gold, Aaron David Miller, Ben Wiedemann as well. Thank you all for your reporting, both from Washington and on the ground there. We'll continue to follow the breaking news out of Israel, of course.
Also back here in the U.S., the family of Andrew Brown Jr. seeing the body cam footage of his final moments this hour. So we're live for you in Elizabeth City, North Carolina.